All right. All right, so welcome back. The new assignment went out last night for this module, which is the adding JavaScript logic to the facade, the HTML prototype that we've been working for the last couple of weeks. So this one is the first of two assignments. The first one, introduces you how to use AngularJS and use Angular routing mechanisms, and how to implement single-page applications. The second half, which is going to be right after this one, will see how Angular can be used to interact with jQuery as well. Right now, what we've seen so far was jQuery being able to manipulate the DOM, right, using being able to directly manipulate the DOM by grabbing various portions of the DOM using CSS3 rules, and then either adding or removing or showing or hiding things by calling many of the jQuery's functions on that DOM. We're going to depart from that when we go into Angular. It's going to be a little more high level. Right? Angular uses an abstraction called the model view controller, and that gives you a higher level API of how it interacts with the DOM. But before we do that, I'd like to discuss the project. What's a proposal that's due later this week, and just give you some general ideas on how you might go about documenting UML class diagrams or wireframes or flow diagrams. Okay. So let's open up here somewhere where I can draw. All right, so I'm going to talk about general ideas, right, that need to be mapped to your particular domain, right? I've heard people that chose sports as their domain. Others are movies. Others have chosen recipes or food, but they all have certain things that are in common, right? So a lot of things I'm going to be talking about are very general, and you'll have to make an effort to see how this maps to your particular domain. Okay. Oops. All right. So first we said that we're going to capture a couple of types of users, right? And some of you are struggling. Well, what kind of user am I talking about? Now, it could be that your particular application is one user, and that's all you really need. But it gets interesting when you at least have two types of users and how they interact with one another. So what we might do is either you come up with two types of users and see how they interact, or what you might want to do is see one user, right? You can choose a user and see how that one particular user interacts with other users of the same type. Okay, so I think that's a fair compromise. Okay. Yes.
So if a user has two roles, like all the users might have two roles, is it fine?
That would be considered as two users. Yes. So yeah. So let's see. Let's look at what the wireframes might look like. Okay. So let's see. So typically you will have some kind of home page, right? And in that home page, you might have some some blurbs, some marketing blurb, right, or some landing page where you want to entice a person to stay, right? So you might have some images here, maybe a carousel where you go through several nice, interesting images, or maybe you take up the entire page and you have some image. And in here you might have some content that was generated very recently by users of your system, right? Maybe the last couple of posts, or the last couple of images that were uploaded, or the last whatever, right? Kind of like a news where you might want to determine that there is some activity in your live activity in your website. So then typically all the domains that I've heard involve some form of searching or finding information about a particular domain, right? Either you're looking for a recipe, or you're looking for a particular sports team, or you're looking for weather information, or whether some song or some movie, or you're looking for something, right? And so typically you'll have some kind of search page, right, where you might have a search page where you will either have some kind of search, right, with an icon there, and either display search results right here in the same page, or you might go to a separate dedicated page. Either one, you'll have probably have some kind of third-party API that lives on the cloud, right, where you will send your query, right? You'll send some kind of query in some format, right? Whatever URL format that they're providing, and this will respond to you with with some array, some JSON array, right? And we demonstrated this in the last class, right? We did it with jQuery. In this case, you'll either use jQuery or you use Angular, right, to do the same thing, right? Same functionality. And typically, the format of these objects is that each object will be uniquely identified, right? And in the case of last week, we were looking at querying for movies. Each movie was uniquely identified by some kind of ID, right? And this ID is very important because you should be able to use that same ID, right, to use other APIs provided by the same provider to go and fetch more information about that same movie or that same domain object, right? Whatever domain object. I'm calling this some generic term, domain object, right? Because that domain object can be, again, it could be a recipe or a sports team or a car or a movie, whatever domain object it is for your particular domain, yes? But nonetheless, each one of these domain objects should be uniquely identified, so that's all you really care, that uniquely identifier that allows you to perhaps query some more details about that domain object, yes? And that domain object is really all you really need to store in your local database, right? So that at a later time when you want to know the details about that particular object, you can fetch that information again from the API, right, without having to cache any of that information in your local database, right? You should use this remote API as if it were an extension, right, like a data source, right, as a database that somebody else is maintaining, right, and you can always retrieve it if you keep track of that unique ID, right? You shouldn't have to cache any of that information in your local database, right? Perhaps you might want to cache some minor things, such as maybe obviously the ID, right? But you might want to cache certain things, maybe a thumbnail, right? Maybe a title, or maybe the name of an author, or the actual name of the team, right? Some minor information that you might want to cache locally, so that if you're going to list, sports teams that you've bookmarked, or certain cars that you've bookmarked, or movies or songs that you've bookmarked, yes, you don't want to go and have to fetch, 10 or 20 or 30 movies, right? With all the information that that pertains, only to show the title or the thumbnail, right? So you might want to cache that piece of information locally in your local database, right? Anyway, so you got the ID, and you might want to display maybe a summary of your results, right? in our case, right, last week in our example, we were showing a thumbnail for the poster, a synopsis of a short plot, and the title of the movie. Remember that, right? So this would be the summarized view of that search. Yes. If I click on any one of these, I would navigate to some kind of details page, right? Some details page where, oops, where I have details. Now in the details, I might go a little further, right? I might display not only the title and the author. I might go and perhaps display a synopsis of the movie, or lyrics for a song, or I don't know, if it's a recipe, maybe I would show maybe the ingredients, right? So I'd show more details, more detailed information. For the details, I still can go. For the details, I have the ID, right? I can go fetch from the API. I provide the ID, which is provided to me by the navigation between the search page, right, and into details page, and I can use that ID to go fetch the details for that particular domain object, right? So in the first page, I show a summary of many objects, domain objects, as opposed to in the details page, I show details about a particular domain object. Make sense? Right? And the way these interact with one another is by the ID. Notice that I don't have anything in my database just yet, right? And notice that none of this has a need for me to log in or you identify who am I, right? Because I'm not storing anything in the database. This is all interacting with the remote API, right? If in the details, right, maybe I want to bookmark it, right? I want to bookmark it and say this is my favorite. Now I need to know who you are, right? Because I need to make a relationship between a particular user and this particular domain object, right? I have to keep track of this relationship, right? Or this user likes this movie, right? Or this user likes this recipe, or this user likes this car, or this user likes whatever, right? So if I try to bookmark it, then I need to be able to be challenged, right? Some kind of login page says, well, who are you? I don't know who you are, right? So I need to go through some kind of login, username, password, right? And then maybe come back to the page, to the details page, right? Once now I know who you are. Now I can bookmark it, right? You might also have in these detail. You might also have in these detail maybe reviews or comments or some information about that other users have made about that particular domain object, right? So some reviews or comments or whatever, right? That information, again, depend on the domain object, right? These reviews might come from either two places. These reviews might come from the site where you go, and maybe you're grabbing it from Yelp, right? Or maybe you're grabbing it from Amazon. They already provide lots of reviews, right? Lots of information, and you might want to display that here, right? But none of that data lives in your database, yes? But you might want to provide the capability of providing reviews right here on your site, right? Now, it could be that Amazon allows you to post reviews, unlikely, okay? Or Twitter might allow you to post tweets, or Facebook. Those certainly allow you to create that kind of content. But ideally, you want to allow users that are logged into your website, right, to be able to post comments or reviews. So these users, some of them don't live in your system, right? They are Amazon users, right? They're Yelp users or whatever, right? They're IMDb users. They're not in your system, right? But if I post something here, there's going to be somebody who has logged into my website, right? I'm maintaining their user identity, right? So it's going to be kind of tricky. You can either decide that I am not going to display reviews from a remote site. I'm only going to display reviews from my local site, my site, right? That's a fair decision, right? It's your website. You're maintaining your own community. You're creating your own community, right? You're trying to compete with the Facebooks of the world, right? You're creating your own next Facebook. So you have your own community. There's no need to display anybody else's information. You're just using APIs just as content, right? Aggregators. You're aggregating content from different APIs. Anyway, so let's say that these users are actually your users. Yes? You know, these are users who have logged into your site, have registered on your site. I should be able to either create, post my own comment. Again, if I try to post comments and I haven't logged in, I should be challenged to log in, right? So I know who you are if you're trying to post. If you try to navigate, if I click on somebody's username, I should be able to navigate to their profile. So each user should have a profile. Right? You might have a profile that is like a public profile and then a private profile. In the public profile, you might show things that anybody can read, right? Maybe my username, maybe who I am following, who's following me, things like that, right? You might have a private profile that only you as a logged in user should be able to see, right? Maybe your email, unless you've made it public, right? Your address, your phone, things that might be private to you. So this profile might have the capability of you selecting what things you want to make public or not, right? Anyway, but in your profile, you might want to show, right, some information, and depending if it's you are logged in, you see the whole thing, or if someone just clicks on a URL, comes to see your profile, they can only see the public profile. Anyway, but if it's you, I should be able to see what? I should be able to see, reviews that I've posted of whatever it is that the domain objects, right? So these might be, right, summary views of whatever I reviewed on, right? I reviewed a book, I reviewed a recipe, I reviewed a car or whatever. And if I click on this, I should be able to navigate to the details page of whatever it is that I have reviewed. I should be able to maybe remove the review. I should be able to edit the review. So this is a pencil. I should be able to edit that review, right? If I clicked on somebody else's username, I can navigate to somebody else's profile. So there's lots of profiles. Each user has a different profile. So I can navigate to their profile. I can like them. I can like that user. Right? It says, ooh, this user has lots and lots of really good reviews, right? That means that I have like a following, right? I can see users, maybe their thumbnails, right, of people I'm following. I should be able to see people who are following me, right? If I click on them, perhaps I can navigate to their profile, right? I should be able to remove them from follows. I don't want to follow you anymore, right? What else? What else is here? Anyway, so what kind of schema you might need for this, right? So let's look at that. What schema might you need? Well, you need to be able to represent the user, right? So you have a user. The user might have first name, last name, username, password, right? Email, right? Some URL, some LinkedIn information, maybe, right? Users that if you're following users, if a user is following another user, right? You'll need some way of representing that relationship, right? So you'll have maybe a follows table saying that, right, that a user is following other users, right? And a user is followed by many users, so it's a many-to-many relationship. Yes. So in the following table, in the follows table, you might have two foreign keys, right, saying that user is following that other user, right? You might have a relationship between a user and some domain object, right? The domain objects might be a domain object, could be a book, a car, a sports team, whatever domain object that is, right? You can either have a one-to-many, right? One user has a relationship with many domain objects. More likely, you'll have something like this instead. This is a domain object, right? And you'll have some relationship like this, some relationship that says, maybe I bookmarked, or maybe I created a review, right? A user created many reviews on many domain objects, right? So a user makes many reviews on a movie. A user makes many reviews on a sports team. A user makes many reviews, right? And vice versa, right? A movie has many reviews by many users, right? Right. A recipe has many reviews for many users. You see that? So this mapping table in the middle, right, allows you to maintain maintain a one representation for a domain object, right? So if you have a movie, right, and many users have created many reviews about that particular movie, you're not going to represent that movie many times. Yes, you represent the movie just once, right? You represent the movie just once, but then create relationships with many users. Make sense, right? You might have a domain object having relationships with other domain objects, right? Maybe a domain object is a post, right, or was an article, or is a book, right? And you might have if your domain object is a movie, depends how you want to keep track of that. A domain object might have other domain objects, right? Maybe a movie has a many-to-many relationship with actors, right? I don't know if you want to model that. I don't know how deep you want to model your domain objects. Yes. If this is a movie, then this might be actors. Yes. Right. Or maybe these are songs and these are albums. Right. Again, it depends what particular domain objects you're using. Right. And again, you might want to represent it as a one-to-many, or having a relationship, a mapping table between them. Okay. What else? Let's see. Reviews, comments. You might have a roles table. Right. You have a user in many roles. What else? I would expect that for each one of these class diagrams, you follow, standard UML, where you have here you have an actor maybe. In the actor, you'll have all private, first name. It's a string, right? Last name, last name, string, right? You might have date of birth of type date, right? So make sure you use proper UML class diagram nomenclature, right? Also, make sure you represent cardinality, right? One to many, many to many, whatnot. If these are aggregates, right, meaning that right, you either have composition, meaning that if you remove the user, what do you do with all the reviews that user wrote? Do they also are they also removed? Right. So that's a composition, right? There's a life cycle dependency between whoever generated that information and everything that is related to that, the parent of all that data, right? Typically, if you're Facebook, you don't remove anything, right? You do a soft delete, meaning if a person is removed, I keep their content, right? It's just inactive, right? So I flag it as removed, but I don't actually remove it, right? So that you might want to do that instead. So so it's, if you have generalization, if you have different types of users, right? If you have you might have a general user, and you might have a client and an admin or somebody who's selling, right? A seller, a buyer, right? If you have some kind of like an eBay, right? So they're all sharing things that are in common, right? So you might have username, password, all these things are in common with one another, right? So you might have a general user, right? And they all inherit from this general user, right? So Again, use generalization and specialization diagrams. Typical class UML class diagram nomenclature. Okay. What else? That's about it. But yeah, in the so please show what the navigation is, right, between the pages, right, and indicate what information gets passed between these pages, right? Like the ID gets passed between the search screen, right, and the details page, right, from the profile also, right. If I click on a particular element, I need to know the ID, right, so I can show the details page between that. Also show what information gets again in a diagram format, right, in a very generic format, in a very high level format. No details. Please don't go and show me, okay, here's the JSON that I'm getting back. That's way too detailed. So don't show me schemas of JSONs that you're going back and forth. That's later on. We'll work with what that might look like. Okay. Right. This makes a little sense. All right. All right. Close that. All right, so let's talk about the assignment that went out last night. So this is due in 2 weeks from this coming Sunday. And it says that you're going to reuse the same content that you had in the previous assignment, right? So the same content that you had for home, profile, admin, users, forms, and so on and so forth. You're going to reuse that, right? Now, in the previous assignment, we reused, there was a lot of content that was redundant, right? Like, for instance, the header and the sidebar. Those were copied over and over from one page to the next, right? We're going to fix that in this assignment by using Angular's view and router module, right, that allows you to include content dynamically that gets rendered, gets compiled and rendered and shared amongst several pages to build the page dynamically. Okay. A couple of general requirements. You're still going to be doing your work inside of public assignment, right? Don't worry. You can start working on this right away. By now you've tagged your assignments as assignment 1 or version 0.1 or whatever you used, right? And we can always go back to whatever your source code was up until that tag. Okay, so you feel free to start working on it and refactoring and moving things around and start committing. I hope that you're working on this at least a little bit every day, right? I see them. A lot of you are pretty busy, and you have at least 1 or 2 commits a day. That's very good. I don't want to see, I can see your history very well and what the commit history is, right? So what I don't want to see is going out a whole week without doing anything, right? You have this huge commit at the end of the week, right? You should at least do some minor things, even if it's minor. Please get in the habit, right, of doing some commit, even if it's small, right? Every day committing something. Okay, it's better to do these incremental changes where you commit something that your project is in a stable place, right? Instead of committing something at the end and breaking something that then it makes it unuseful, right? All right, so a couple of requirements. So you're doing your work on public assignment. All JavaScript files should use strict, and I'll explain that in a minute. Wherever possible, declare all your code in the immediately invoked function expressions, right? Again, remember, we don't want to litter the JavaScript namespace, right? So all your work should be, each file should have an immediately invoked function, right? We went over that already. Don't use any global variables, no global functions. Use CDNs for all these libraries. So jQuery, Bootstrap, AngularJS routing. Include everything. The only files that you should be linking locally are your own style sheets, right? That are overriding Bootstrap, or your own implementation, right? Your controllers, certainly your AngularJS application, your configuration files. Those should be local to you, right? That you're loading from your own server. Right. So your own style should be under assignment/CSS/styles. So we're going to be doing a single page application from now on. So the first page that gets loaded, right, should be the only page that you load, right? So there shouldn't be any anchors, right, any hyperlinks that navigate you away, right, from the page, unless you're actually navigating away. Maybe you're going out to CNN or Wikipedia or IMDb. That's okay. That makes sense, right? But if you're within your application, there shouldn't be any reloads of the page. Okay, it gets loaded first. For that, we're going to be using Angular routing mechanism. Only use Angular routing mechanism to navigate within. Or if you're familiar with UI routing, you can use that as well. We'll look at UI routing a little later, but if you're already familiar with UI routing, you can use that instead. Okay. Do not reload the page, and do not navigate away from index.html. Right. This should be the only page that ever gets loaded. Okay. All right. In your index, right, you're gonna load everything you need. You're gonna declare your application. You're gonna give your application a name. We'll do that today. You'll load all the libraries, Bootstrap, all the CDNs. You'll create a placeholder where all the content is going to be injected dynamically, right? All the content is going to be loaded dynamically. Then you're going to create a couple of JavaScript files, right, that implement the Angular application, right? Declares the Angular application, gives it a starting point, right? And then separately, you're going to have a configuration file, a separate configuration file, where you do your Angular configuration, right? Right. Each one of the headers and the navigation, they're going to be implemented in separate HTML pages, right? They're going to be dynamically loaded into the index page, right? They're going to be included in the index page dynamically. Each one's going to have a controller, and we're going to have a pattern where each piece is going to live on its own directory. Right now, we have home, profile, all of them living at the root, right, of the assignment. Yes, but each one is going to get somewhat complicated, right? We're going to separate. Each one is going to have a dedicated JavaScript, and is going to have a dedicated HTML template, right? So it's a good practice to create a directory for each feature or each section, right, or each page, right, separately to its own directory, where you have the HTML, right, and you have the JavaScript that go together to control that HTML. Okay, so that's a pattern that we're going to introduce today. So the left navigation lives on its own, the header lives on its own. Then we're going to introduce how to work with the data that is actually going to be rendered, right? So users are going to be rendered dynamically, right? Right now they're hard-coded. I think we have like 3 or 4 users that we are rendering as a table. Instead, we're going to render those users dynamically, right? We don't have a database yet, right? We can't go fetch data from a database, not yet anyway. So instead of hard-coding it in the HTML, for now, we're going to hard-code it in the JavaScript, right? As an array of objects, yes? And then we're going to provide those arrays of objects to the view for rendering as a table. It's going to render the list of users dynamically, right, from JavaScript. Later on in the next assignment, we're going to extend this so that the JavaScript, instead of having it hard-coded in Java, is going to go into a server. It says, hey, server, give me the list of users, right? Give me the list of forms. Give me the list of form fields, right? I will dynamically render those at the front end, right? But for now, we're going to hard-code that in the in the JavaScript. Okay, so we're kind of pushing, right, where the data lives, right? Right now it's hard coded in the HTML. Now it's going to be hard coded in JavaScript, and eventually it's going to be hard coded in the server, and finally it's going to be dynamic on the database. Make sense? Right? Yeah. So the way we're going to provide the data to the front end, we're going to use a design pattern called services, right? Whenever you're going to provide data for anyone, typically we wrap that inside of what's called a service, a data service, right? That allows you to provide an API to interact with the data. Okay, those who have done CS5610, you should be familiar with using web services as an abstraction, right? As an API that nicely abstracts the interaction with the data, right? You never directly manipulate the data, right? You go through a service that they can be shared across, several points in the application. Right? So what can we do with users? Well, we can find a user by username and password, right? This is useful for logging in, right? You provide a username and password. Is this user even in the database, right? And this returns a user if it's found the username with that username and password. Otherwise, returns null. Find all users returns a list of all the users, right? If you're an admin, you like to be able to list all the users, right? So this service allows me to retrieve an array of users. Create user allows me to provide a brand new user when they register, right? Provide username, password, and whatnot, and it creates a user in the database. Again, we don't have a database right now. What it will do is just add it to the current array of users right now in JavaScript. Delete user by ID. Finds a user with the ID, right, and then removes it from the array. Okay. Again, all this is an array that lives in JavaScript, right? Eventually, this will be arrays that come from server, right? So we're going to hard code this array in JavaScript, and as long as we don't reload the page, right, our application maintains the state. When you reload the page, everything gets reloaded, everything gets thrown away, right? The array gets emptied again, right? So we'll be able to work with this, and prototype it. See if we like the user interface. See if we like the interaction. Once we are happy and we can prototype this and we give it to our clients and they say yes, this is what we want, we can then go and fill in the guts of this, make it real. Updated user provides the ID of a user, right? And then maybe a new username or a new information about the user, a new address, new email, and updates that user. Our form service, again, it's a wrapping of the data provided by a form for the forms, right? A list of the forms created by a particular user, right? You can delete forms, you can update forms. So this is a wrapping around that data type. So create form for user. So I can provide a user ID and the form, right? Notice a callback. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we did hint at this a little bit last week when we talked about callbacks. Right? Remember that JavaScript is single-threaded, right? And whenever it interacts with something that takes a long time, right? What we want to do is decouple these two things, right? And last week we saw examples of Ajax. Ajax provides us an ability of doing this asynchronously, right? Instead of blocking and waiting for IMDb to come back, right? We just say, well, notify me when you're done, right? And I provide you with a function for you to call me back, right? So that's that callback there. Even though we're not going to go actually to a server, right? And we're not going to take time to retrieve the data. Nevertheless, we want to start, building the foundation, right? Because eventually, right, we are really going to go out to a server, and we need that mechanism, right, to respond, use it through a callback. Find all forms for a user, delete a form by ID, update a form. Okay. Homepage requirements. Basically, it's going to say, well, remember that home that you created earlier? Okay, well, take only the content, keep that, and remove the header and the sidebar. We're not going to use that anymore, right? All these HTML are going to be partial HTML. Right? These are not HTML documents that are going to be meant to be standalone HTML, right? They're meant to be right, injected, right, or rendered inside of a wrapping HTML, a bigger document. Yes? The bigger document declares HTML, right, the header, the body, right, loads all the libraries. But all these other smaller pieces, like the header, the footer, right, all these, the sidebar, these are partials, right, where they, they have like a snippet of HTML, not the entire document, right? So these partials are not going to have, HTML, head, body, right, link, right, or script, right? All those have been loaded already by index.html. That one does all that heavy lifting, yes? But all these other smaller documents, right, are partials. So the homepage, we're asking, remove the header, remove the sidebar, remove, just keep the title and the paragraph. I think the title said welcome, and then the paragraph was just lorem ipsum, right? That's all you're going to keep, right, for the home, right? And then, you have to do some magic so that you can navigate. If you click on the home page, on the home link, on the sidebar, you actually navigate to the home, right? You have to do some magic there, which we'll show you today and next week. Same thing with login. Notice that we're moving all these content into their own directory, So login, again, remove the header, remove the sidebar, remove everything. Just keep the title, the form, and the button. Right, so remove all those stuff and just keep the contents, the form. Also, we need to tie the actual form. We need to actually retrieve that information, right? Whatever they type for the login, right? The username, the password. We have to retrieve that information and then check with the user service. Hey, does this user exist, right? We have to look up that user. Right? To do that, we'll use models to model the user. We also use a click event handler, right, that can retrieve the user information and then use the user service to see if that user exists. For that, we're going to create a controller. Most of these pages are going to have not only the HTML, but they're going to have also a controller that goes along with it, right? Which is going to implement the event handler, right? Right, retrieving the click events, right, and then retrieving the information from the form, and actually going out to the server. Well, not really the server. Going to the service to see if the user actually exists. Make sense? Right? So the controller is going to have an event handler called login, which is going to use the user service to look up the user to see if they exist, right? And then navigate to the profile if the user exists. Right? Navigate to the profile if the user actually exists. Otherwise, give some error message. Right? That user doesn't exist. The registration page, same thing. We're going to have a partial for the registration, right, inside of register.view. And it's going to have a controller in register.controller. Same thing. We're going to have a form. We're going to retrieve the data from the form. We're going to look up the user. If they already exist, we can't register them again, right? If they don't exist, we're going to add it to the array through the user service. And if they register successfully, we navigate to the profile page, right, and we log them in. Okay. The profile page, we're gonna render the profile for the particular user who's logged in, right? And so we're going to use the ID of the user that's logged in to display the information for that particular user. Again, we're going to go out to this service and say, okay, for this ID of the user who's currently logged in, I want to show the details for that particular user, right? And this one is going to allow us to update the user, right? It's going to have an update event handler. But if you click on the update button, it's going to read the information from the form and use the user service to update that particular user in the array of users. Form page. Form page is going to have a tabular list of all the forms, right? The names of the forms. You can add new forms. You can delete the form, right? You can rename a form. In the prototype, we had also fields. Yes, right. We're going to leave fields for the next assignment. We're only going to do forms for this assignment, right? In the next assignment, we'll add fields, and we're going to have to create a relationship, right, between here's users. A user has many forms, and each form has many fields, right? To do that, we're going to need a couple more things before we get there. Also, because in fields, you need to be able to rearrange fields, right? Drag them, reposition them. For that, we need jQuery, and AngularJS sometimes doesn't play nice with jQuery, right? So we need to introduce that topic, right? Which we haven't talked about that yet. Right? Anyway, read through this, and please, if you have questions, please come with questions next time we meet. All right. All right. Let's talk about Angular. Any questions so far? A lot of this might not make sense just yet because I'm using a lot of jargon that is Angular specific, right? So let's dive into Angular. All right. Let's create a directory here where we can talk about Angular. We already have Angular, so let's create it under here. Okay, in here, we'll create here a file called intro. There we go. All right. Okay. Let's see if this is deployed. Let's load a couple of libraries here. Let's load Bootstrap. Let's say Bootstrap CDN. Let's copy that. So that's link. Relationships is the style sheet, and the href is that. Okay. And then we're going to load also now a couple of JavaScript libraries here. Right. And the library that we want to load is the Angular library. Right. So let's look at Angular. AngularJS. So AngularJS, as I mentioned earlier, right, it's a higher level library that allows you to interact with the DOM at a higher level. Right? jQuery is a little too low level, right? That allows you to interact with the DOM directly, right? It allows you to grab things from the DOM, particular elements, right? And allows you to style it, to append to it, to remove it, to wrap it around. It really gives you a direct manipulation access to the DOM. AngularJS, so jQuery doesn't force you to think in any particular way, right? You already know the CSS, allows you to build on top of what you already have, right? A lot of the knowledge that you already know about, CSS and manipulation of the DOM, right? And also, it doesn't impose any particular view, right? It's not opinionated on how is it that you should touch and manipulate your DOM, right? Instead, AngularJS does impose on you a particular way of thinking about on implementing web applications, right? It imposes one particular design pattern called the model view controller design pattern, right? Which it's not a bad thing, right? The model view controller has proven to be very useful in web development for quite a while, certainly in desktop UI development, also in web development where you have client-server applications. Also has proved very useful to think about having in the HTML be the view, whether it's rendered dynamically using ASP or JSP. That is typically considered to be the view, right? And then you have some kind of back-end server services that controllers that receive events from the view as they click, as they submit forms, right? As they provide data, and the controller then decides, who has to handle that, right? It passes it down to some back-end server-side objects, right? That or business logic that that looks at the request, right, and provides a response to some data that can then be provided by the controller to the view to be rendered by some other view, right? It's the controller who decides, you know, how to navigate from one page to the other page. But notice that it's spread over, you know, several tiers of the application, right? The client side on the HTML, the controller on the server, right? Some backend, and some database also on the server. So it's across several tiers, and sometimes is referred to as a multi-tiered application where you have all these middleware, front end, and the client, and then some back end where you have all these services in between. Angular takes that model view controller idea and brings it to the front end, right? Brings it to the client, brings it to the browser, and says, hey, you can apply that same idea, right? But you can compress it all on the client, right? On the JavaScript, right? Because, you know, the browser, as we've seen, has become a legitimate, you know, framework where you can actually implement full-blown applications right on the browser, right? Now, obviously, running on the browser gives you some limitations, right? You don't have a database, right? Where do you get the data, right? How do you store things? How do you maintain state? How do you, right? But that's okay, right? You can always provide services, right, and abstractions that allow you to always almost use the servers almost like a hard drive, right, where you can store data and retrieve data, but the main logic of the application is on the client. The problem with that is that if you have everything on the client, you know, you're kind of exposing everything, right? Everybody's looking at your business logic, everybody's exposing. So usually we still maintain the client to be as dumb as possible, you know, as dynamic as possible, so that the user can have a, you know, very good experience. But the bulk of the business logic still resides on the server, right? We provide a domain objects, right, and arrays and JSONs for the view to render, you know, and display and be very dynamic. But the bulk of the domain objects, right, of the business logic still resides on the server, right? So you have this Angular always going back to the server, right, and say, well, these are the events and the things that the user wants to do. I'll give it to you. You tell me what should be displayed. Give me the data that I need to display dynamically, right? And Angular can then take this domain model, right, and then display it dynamically on the client. Anyway, so let's look at how Angular behaves. Here's you can download the library, right? This if you download this will download the core of the library. This has grown to be quite a lot of features. So they've broken up into different modules, right? Which will be using some of these, but right now let's only focus on the core module, right? You can download it and have it locally, or better yet, we can look for an Angular CDN, right? And we can link to it. Nope. Downloading. So here's an example on how to grab it. Right, we can copy that script and we just paste it in here. There it is. Notice that it's downloading from ajaxgoogleapis.com. You see that? So that's one very common CDN that is hosting this, right? And you can load it in there. Everybody good? Right. Let's see if this is working. Let's just say hello here. Let's say div class container. Right, that's Bootstrap, and let's say h1 hello from AngularJS. Okay, let's navigate to this. Where is this at? This is at lectures, AngularJS intro. Actually, let me rename that to be. Let me rename that. Where's refactor? Oh, there we go. We call that index. There we go. So let's see. It's it's localhost, and it's under lectures, AngularJS, AngularJS, intro. Here it is. So hello from AngularJS. So it's deployed, right? It's on my local server. Okay, so let's get started. So one of the things that Angular does when you load this this script, okay, is that it takes over your page. Okay, it creates a domain, it creates a model of your page because it will be responsible for manipulating your page. Right? Now, to declare this as an Angular application, we're going to use the ng attribute, ng app attribute, right? That is one of many attributes that are declared by Angular. Angular it is very opinionated, right? It does create several new attributes, right? It extends the syntax of HTML, right? It allows you to have a brand new attributes declared by the language, allows you to declare brand new tag elements, right? And it allows you to interact with the framework either as new tags, new attributes, or new classes. Right? It allows you to grab the DOM in these various ways. Right? So here's one of the attributes that are declared by the framework, ng app. Right? And what it does, it allows you to declare this page as an Angular application. This is an Angular application. Okay, we'll say that this is whiteboard app, right, as opposed to blackboard. Okay, whiteboard app, and in here we can declare now that different pieces of the HTML are going to be controlled by this application, right? You can determine and say, hey, this snippet of HTML is going to be controlled by Angular, right? And the way we do that is by controllers, so we're going to be writing that in a minute. Okay. All right. So here we've declared ng app whiteboard, right? To do that, to create our application, our very first application, we're going to load our application with a script. We're going to say source, and we're going to load app.js. Right? So we're going to create our Angular application inside of a script app.js. It's a very common name for applications. So let's create app.js here. Say app.js. And in here, we're going to do our iffy. Okay. And in here, we're going to use the Angular library, right, to be able to create our application. Angular declares a global name called Angular, just like jQuery declares a global name jQuery. And a lot of these libraries they do declare these global variables from which you can then interact with the framework. So let's create our first application, Angular. Okay, so Angular provides quite a bit of functions in here, right? It allows to create all the various artifacts that make up an application, right? The base artifact that allows you to create applications is the module, right? Angular allows you to create all sorts of little modules that can then be incorporated with one another, right, to build a larger application. Okay, very much like in C++, you might split it up into separate files, right, or that can then be loaded or imported, right? Or Java, you can have different classes, right, that can then be loaded or imported as well, right? And then you break it up into various classes. Here, the basic building block is the module, right? And you create a module by using the module function. Okay? There's always a top level module, right, which is kind of like my starting point that can then load other smaller modules that can then be reused in your module. Right? And the way you declare a module is by giving it a name. Right? You give it a name. In this case, it has to match either has to match this application. If it matches this, it's the top level module, right? It's the module that implements the application, right? But you can create many other modules, right? And give them their own names, right? Which can then be loaded by the top level module. Okay, and the way they're loaded. So first, let's declare whiteboard app. The way they're loaded is by providing an array. You can provide an array, and here you can list the names of other modules that your module depends on. Okay. Right now, we're not depending on any other module. We're not depending on any other module. So the array is empty. Okay? But you still have to provide the array nevertheless. Even if it's empty, you need to provide an empty array. Okay. Later on today, or maybe next week, right? We'll use a module that allows us to do navigation. It allows you to navigate between pages as you click around, right? All right. All right, so we've declared our module. In our index page now, we're gonna declare that we want our application to do something with our HTML, right? Let's say that we're gonna and the way this works is that you have to marry, right, what the view is with the controller, right? If you remember in the MVC, you have to say the controller controls what the view is going to render, right? So we have to somehow marry these two things. What is the view, and who's the controller that is responsible for that particular view, right? So to do this, we declare a piece of the DOM as a view, right? That is going to be controlled by a controller, and say, well, I'm going to say that this particular view, this particular piece of HTML, is going to be controlled by a particular controller, right? So this snippet of DOM, right, is going to be the responsibility of that particular controller, which we haven't created yet, right? So let's create a simple, trivial controller. Right? We're going to say a hello controller. Oh, hello world controller. Okay. All right, it must be the IDE parses it out, right, and finds these things. But this hello world controller doesn't actually exist in my domain, right? In my little world here, it doesn't exist. So let's create that controller, hello world controller. Hello world controller. We can go back to the app, and we can create that controller, right? Instead of creating it, we can do it here. Well, let's create it here very easily. But a better practice is to put it in a separate file. Okay, but to keep it simple, let's do it right here, right? We can say AngularJS, right? For the module whiteboard app, okay, I want to create a controller. Okay, I want to create a controller that has the name that I chose earlier, hello world controller, right? And it's implemented by this function, right? If you don't like that syntax, which I don't like, right? Instead, you can provide the name of a function, right, and then implement the function elsewhere. Okay. I prefer this syntax. It's actually a better syntax. And this hello is just gonna, for now, right, it's just gonna say console.log hello world. Okay. All right, let's refresh this, inspect and look at the console. Let's really notice that it says hello world, right? So what's happening here is that Angular, right, this whiteboard app, right, was declared in the app. There it is, it got declared. And later on, I use this. This says, well, grab that module I declared somewhere, which actually in the previous line I did, right? Grab it, find it. Notice that I did not provide an argument. I didn't provide anything else here. Okay. When you provide it like this, it's a read operation. You are retrieving that module. You are retrieving that module. And now that you have the module, on that module, I am calling another function called controller. Right? For that module, we're declaring a controller named Hello World Controller. So this module, this controller lives in that module. Right? So you can separate controls by module. Right? So you have a very big piece in your application, right, that deals with users, right? And that users has lots of pages, right? I want to be able to, view their profile. I want to be able to edit them. I like to, create users, delete users, whatever, a whole bunch of pages, yes? So it's a big chunk of your application. It makes sense to put that in a module, right, with lots of pages and controllers for user, right? And then if you have another one that allows you to manipulate courses, right, in sections, right, allows you to create courses and edit courses and register people and students and whatnot, that might be another module, right? Right, that has its own, a whole bunch of pages, a whole bunch of controllers, and you put it under that module. It allows you to break up the application into separate modules. You can then load them into a bigger application here and list all the modules that this application depends on. Yes? Make sense? All right. We're not there yet. We don't have that complexity yet, right? But it's a very common way of breaking things up. Okay. Okay, so hello world. Anyway, so right now I'm doing something very, very simple. I'm just spinning it out into the console, right? What I really want to do is manipulate the DOM, right? The HTML that I have here. Right? I want to manipulate stuff in here, right? So I want to be able to. So already these two are married, right? We know that this div is somehow related to that controller, right? What happened is that Angular, this application, parsed the HTML. Parses the HTML. It looks at this DOM and says, oh, this DOM is associated to this controller. Okay, so this div, right? This div is now the context of that controller. This controller is responsible for this div. Whatever happens inside of this div, it is the controller's responsibility, right? The controller can manipulate the content of this div. Other divs outside, if I have other divs out here, and this controller has no idea this div even exists, right? So there's scoping, right? There's scoping here, unlike jQuery, right? jQuery can do whatever it wants, right? It can grab things. There's no scoping. You would have to create your own scoping mechanism for jQuery, right? This one allows you to break up the page, right? And says, oh, well, this part of the page is controlled by this controller and that other part of the page. So you can have maybe a header controller, a footer controller, a sidebar controller, a main content controller, right? And each one, right, is responsible for its own little piece of the page. Make sense? Right? And each one is, so it allows you to create a scope. Make sense? All right, so scope. That's a big, important concept in Angular, right? So how does this controller manipulate its scope? How do we do it? Right? The way jQuery does it is that it uses CSS3 rules, right, to directly refer to DOM elements. Right? You give it a CSS rule, and it maps to some element in the DOM. Not here. Right? We are going to do this at a high level, right? Angular is not meant to directly, right, impact a particular DOM element, right? Even though it does it at a high level. Okay, if we think about it at a higher level, right? So one of the things that it can do is you can do templates. You can do a template. You can say hello. You can create placeholders. You can create a placeholder here, and then the controller sees that. Oh, you declare a variable. You declare a variable called hello which I can do something from the controller. I can inject content in here dynamically, right? So how do we do that? How do we marry this variable that I've just declared in HTML and I marry it to the controller, so to some domain model, right? So what we want to be able to do is that we want to think about the data that gets rendered in the view as a model, as data, right? Not as DOM, right? As HTML. That's too low level. We want to think about this as a model, as a schema, right? We want to think about this as classes, properties, values. At that high level, we don't want to have to think about the low level HTML, right? Have the view care about the HTML, right? The controller thinks about data, right? And provide data to the view, and the view will decide how to render it, right? That's the mantra in MVC. MVC says, if you're caring about how to rendering, that's the view, right? And the view is provided with some data, and the view will render that data in, using its own particular DOM or HTML or whatever it uses to render, right? The controller and the data model care about the data, right? What the schema, right? What the data that is going to be provided to the view. So the controller here thinks about in terms of data. So what data do we know? Well, we just created one. We just created this variable called hello. So the controller can say, okay, I want to have access to that variable that the view declared, right? And the way we do that is by using the idea of context, right? Of scope. Remember, this div is the scope of this controller, right? And the way they talk to one another is by a very well-known variable called the scope, $scope. $scope represents the, right, that div, right, that it is responsible for. Each controller can have its own scope. So if I declare another controller with another scope, maybe for the header, that will be its scope. If I have another controller that declares for the sidebar, it'll have its own scope, right? And they have no connection with one another, right? They're local. So from the point of view of the controller, I have access to all the data or variables that either the view declares, right? For instance, I have that hello. Hello, I can say, hello world, right? I can send data to the view and say, hey view, here's data for you for rendering, right? So when I render it, it says hello world. You see that? The view got a hold of the data because the controller gave it to it. The controller said, hey, you know that variable you have there? Right? I am giving you the data. And the view says, I have data for this. Let me render it. Make sense? Now, so the way we think about this is that the controller provided the data and the view rendered it. Well, it's actually both ways. It works both ways, right? If the view somehow manipulates that data, the controller will be notified. It says, something changed in the view, right? There is a binding, there's a two-way binding, right, in these variables. Whatever the controller does to that variable, updates the view. Whatever the view does to the variable, updates the controller. Right? There's a two-way binding here, okay, which is very, very important. So definitely, we have templates. Templates also, one other thing is templates allow you to put content anywhere in the HTML, right? Notice that this is free form, free text, right? That is being rendered. Okay. If instead it's data that lives inside of a particular element, for instance, if I say input, right? And I want to, data that is associated to a particular input field. Right? So here I have an input field. You can have a placeholder. I say course name and class form field. Oops, sorry. If I have what happened? Form control, sorry. Form control. There it is, right? So there's a form control course name. You see that? Right? Well, I can also associate, right, the data for this input field. I can associate it with the controller and says, hey, controller, just like I declare hello here as a free-form text, yes? Well, here I am going to declare another variable for this. I'm going to declare another variable, but it's going to be bound to the data of this input field, right? So I can say, we can say ng model. We can declare a variable using a new attribute in the Angular syntax, where I can declare and say, hey, this input field, the data of this input field, I'm going to bind it to a variable. I'm going to say course name. Okay. So now the view has declared a variable, okay? And it says I'm going to give it a name, course name, right? And now the controller is now going to be aware of this variable, right? So if I just render it, right, it's not going to do anything. But right, I could certainly say here, right, scope dot course name, right, Java 101. Bless you. Okay, I can send data to the view for rendering, and indeed the view renders it. It says, you gave me data for this input field. How does it render? Oh, it renders inside of the. You mean that it's the value of this input field, right? I can bind it in the view. I can bind it just like I bound hello. I can bind a placeholder. I can say course name. Maybe put it inside of H1, H2 maybe. Okay, again, a placeholder inside of an H2, and it's this variable course name, which is the same one as this. So these are bound, right? Anywhere where I say course name, anywhere, right, within the scope of the controller, right, that anything happens to this course name, right, it will propagate, right, so that everybody is in sync. Wherever this course name appears will be synced, right? So if I reload this, notice that it's Java 101, just like that input field, just like that input field, right? And if I type here, right, notice that it gets updated, right? Because these are bound, right? Whatever happens to the view is receiving all this data as you're typing. It notifies the controller. You go, hey, this data change, this variable change, and the controller says, well, I have other people who are interested in the value of this variable. I have this placeholders elsewhere. I better notify them. Okay, and so there's two-way binding that allows you to have this connection between these things. Okay, very, very important, right? Notice that I haven't created any event handlers. Right? How would I do this in jQuery? Imagine in jQuery I would need to, right, grab the input field. I would have to create an event, a key press event handler, right, that listens in for the keystrokes, right? I would have to, every time I press a key, I would have to update some variable, right, and then go off and update any H1s or H2s, right, that I would have to grab all of them, right, and go and update all of them, right? It would take me, I don't know, 5-10 lines to do this, right? But notice that this high level of thinking, right? Notice that nowhere does the controller know anything about the DOM, right? That's too low level for the DOM. The DOM, I mean for the controller. Sorry, the controller is only responsible, right, for maintaining a data model, an object, right? So for instance, I might have here a scope, a user, right, and the user might be an object, right? Well, you might have first name, Alice, right? You might have last name, right? Wonderland, right? And notice that basically once I assign it to a scope variable, right, the view is now aware of this object, but nobody's rendering it. The view is not rendering it because it doesn't know anything about it. Okay, I can ask the view and say, hey view, render that in a paragraph perhaps. I can say user. It's that same variable over here that's declared right here, right? If I render that, notice that it renders the raw JSON, right? The raw stringified name of the JSON. Notice that it even added the string, the double quotes that I didn't add it, right? It's its way that knows that this is a JSON object and this is how JSON objects are rendered. Okay, you can be more specific and say here in a UL, because I want to render it in a UL, I can say first name. I can say user.fname, right? And then a last name. Last name. If I render it, then we have first name Alice in Wonderland. Again, the controller has absolutely no idea how this is being rendered. If it's a table or a UL or a paragraph, it doesn't care. The controller should never, ever care how this is going to be rendered. That is a job of the view. The view is the one who's going to decide how to render this. Okay, it is a concern of the view. Are we using a table? What are we using? Okay, the controller only provides data to the view, right? Not only can we have objects, but we can have maybe arrays, right? So you might have here maybe var course. The course maybe has a title, and this is C# 101, and the seats. There's 25 seats, and it starts new date. Okay. Then you might have an array of courses, so var courses, right? And here you might have the first course is the course we just created, right? The second course might be an embedded object that I'm going to add here. Okay, so what are you complaining about? Oh, wrong language. There we go. So an embedded object, I might have another title, and this one is PHP 101. Seats is 12 seats, and it starts new date. I think it's 2015, 9/12. And maybe another one. Additional one. 15, and maybe 34, and this is Angular, Node.js. Node.js 101. Right? I can send that to the view for rendering. I can say scope.courses equal courses, right? And then the view can then render it, right? I can say render up here and say H2 courses, and I can then render just courses, right? So this is the raw courses, right? And if I render it, notice that it's that array, right? It's that array rendered as a JSON object, right? Notice that we have the C#, then PHP, Node.js, right? So what the controller is concerned is, how do I represent the model, the data that I want to send to the view, right? The controller is also going to be responsible for retrieving data from the server, right? Never directly through the server, always through a service, okay? Which we'll talk about services next week, okay? Right now, it's just raw data. You can start playing around with this, what this might look like, right? If it's since it's an array, perhaps a better way to render this would be using a table, right? So we can create a table, class table, table striped. And inside of that table, we can have a head with some headers, maybe with the title of the course, the seats that are available, and the date that it starts, right? And in the body, we can decide that we want to render, right? We want to render the courses as a table row, right? And this is what the idea that we had last week when we were talking about using templates, right? Remember the template idea that we had? What we do? We would declare an ID for the table row, right? We would grab that dynamically from jQuery, would remove it, right? And then clone that over and over and over for each one of the objects as we iterated over the array of objects. Remember that? Okay. Well, same thing here. We want to be able to declare some kind of templates, right? And the template might look like maybe a table data for the title, right? We want the table data for the seats, right? Another table data for the start date, okay? So to declare the template in Angular, something similar to what we do is says, we're going to say, hey, take this table row, okay? And I want you to copy and paste this for every instance of a collection. We need to tell it what the collection is, right? And we need to give it the name, of each individual item, okay? So to do that, we use another ng attribute. We're going to say ng repeat, meaning do this tr, this table row, over and over and over for each course in courses. So what's courses? It's the courses object that we just rendered here, right? Over here, we just told it just the raw courses, right? So it rendered as a raw array of objects. Here, we're using it in a little higher context, right? Inside of an ng repeat. Ng repeat is a Angular specific attribute, right? So it knows how to parse this. Okay, it parses this string and says, oh, okay, so this is that's the collection of data, right? And as I, copy and clone this, right? The DOM element that I am assigned to here, each instance is going to be bound to the course variable, right? So the course variable is going to change. At first, it's going to be C#, then it's going to be PHP, and then it's going to be Node.js. Yes? Right? So in the context of this ng repeat, we can have a template here. We can say course. What course is that? It's this course, right? As it iterates over each one of the courses. Yes? So what I want to put here, I want to say course.title, right? In here, it will be course.seats, and then course.starts. It starts? Okay, right? If we go back and render our little thing here, notice that it renders, right, as table rows, right? It took that table row, right? It took it as a template and says, okay, I just need to, iterate over the courses, and for each course, I'm going to use the template and fill in those blanks, right, with the instance as I iterate over this. That makes sense? Okay. Yes.
Instead of course title, could we have taken the span and included ng-model for the course title?
Oh, span? Yes, you could do span, right? It says ng model equal course title. No, it doesn't do that. No, you use a template for this. Use a regular template for this. Yeah. Course title. There it is. So notice that it's representing the date, right, as a raw string representation, right, of the date object, right? You can use filters, right? You can use a bar, right, to invoke filters on how to format or add, formatting of the, if it's an integer or if it's a currency, right? You can AngularJS provides a set of filters that can take the data, right, massage the data before it's actually rendered, right? So you could say that this is a date. Okay, there it is. So it's using the default format of the date, okay, which is a short format, right? It's the abbreviated month, day, and then the year, right? As opposed to the raw string representation of the date, right? And there's a whole bunch of filters. You can create your own filters too, right? If you say currency, it'll take. You can say, well, I want to in euros or whatever, right? In whatever comma or period or whatever you want to use, or date. This is the default Western representation, but certainly you can have military, right, or European, or be a locale to East Asian or whatnot. Okay, right. Other things that you can add here is you can create actions. Okay? So you could have at the end, you have a button maybe. You have a button, right, and say that button. If I click on it, maybe I want to remove it. Maybe I want to create a button that says remove. Right, and this will be maybe class button danger. Right, so then a remove button, right? That right now it doesn't do anything, right? But I can create event handlers, right? So if this button gets clicked, and you click, I want to notify my controller. We'll tell my controller, hey, the user clicked on this, right? So I'm going to call a function that's called remove course, right? And that remove course can be implemented in the controller and says, okay, well, the view called it remove course, so I'm going to implement here a function called remove course, right? It's a function. It gets invoked, right? And for now, we're just going to say console.log remove. Okay. If you go back, reload this, right? If I click on remove, notice that it clicks on remove. So I've created an event handler, right? Again, in jQuery, I would need to say what? Right, to grab the ID of each one of these, right, and say, dot click and call a function, right? It's not that much more work, but check this out. I can pass along here. I can pass as an argument. I can pass course, right? The instance that was used to render this particular row, right? The particular instance that was used to render this particular row. So in the controller, I can say, oh, you can pass me the course instance, the original course instance that was used for that particular row, right? And I can do course instance, right? Now, when I render, right, and I click on these, and click remove, notice that I get the original object that was used to render this row, right? Notice C#, right? If I can click on this, it's PHP 101, right? Right, Node.js. Look at that, right? So it bounded, right, with the table row, the original object, the instance that was used for rendering this row. And I can retrieve the original object that was used, right? Very, very cool. Right? Imagine, again, what would I need to do this in jQuery, right? I would need to, by hand, if I want this kind of thing, right? I would need to bind the object to the table row, right? Using data bind, right? And then once I retrieve it, I need to get the original table row and grab the table data, the data that was used for rendering this, right? So it would not be trivial. Over here, you get that for free, right? We can certainly, if we want to actually remove, we can calculate the index of this object in the original array, right? We could say the original array, this is the original array, that's the original array of courses. We can find the index of, and say dot doing dot index of the course instance. I can say, hey, this object that you're giving me, it's part of an original array, right? Where is it in that array? That's what this is asking. So I can say var index. And now I know, right? Given the original array, this object that came, right, that was originally used to render that row, where is it in that array? Right, what index am I? Is it the first one, the second one, the third? Which one is it? Right. So I can do a console index. If I click on this one, it comes back with 0. It is the first one, right? If I click on this one, it says 1 or 2. So it knows where it is, right? Well, guess what? We can use that index to splice out that object from the original array. I can say scope.courses splice. Splice is a JavaScript method that updates the array, removing an object from the array, right? You can say, which one do you want to remove? Or which element in the array do you want to remove? You give it the index, right? And how many do you want to remove, right? Just one. You can say more than one, right? I believe, I think if it's one, it's optional. I don't remember. Splice it out. So now if I reload this, right? If I reload this and I click here, look at that, it's gone. It's gone. I removed it from the array, and the controller says, oh, the array changed. The array changed state, right? I need to notify the view that the array has changed. The view says, the array changed. I need to re-render that array because that's the array that I'm responsible for rendering, right? So the view has a listener, right, on these. So Angular generates all these listeners, right, on what the model is doing, right, and make sure that everybody's notified whenever the model changes, right, so that everybody's always in sync, right? If the controller makes any changes to the model, the view gets notified so that the view can update itself. And if the view changes the model, right, the controller gets notified, right, and vice versa. Right? It's a two-binding, right, mechanism that always maintains these two things in sync, right? So there it is, right? Again, imagine how much work would this be to do this with raw JavaScript, okay? Right, your updating model is immediately being updated in the view. Very, very nice. Right? Again, I have a couple of examples already there available. Please go through those examples. I will push this as an additional example there so you can peruse through this, right? But please go over the examples that are already there and get familiar with them and come back next week with questions. Yes?
Does every controller have at most one function?
No, what do you mean? Event handlers?
Yeah.
No, you can have any number of event handlers. This one you mean?
The one, hello world controller.
Yeah, no, it's one. Yeah, it's a constructor actually. It creates the instance, right, of the controller. Yes.
Can you use save controller for multiple games and share the content?
No, no. The controller is only one. What you can do is share scopes, right? So you can have a top-level scope, right, which can then be shared amongst 2 or 3 controllers, right? We'll talk about next week about a root scope, right? There's automatically created a root scope which is bound to the entire document that you can then share with that. Although it's not a good idea to do that. We'll see how to share data amongst controllers. Right? Typically, it's through a service. You declare a shared service that then controllers can use, like the user, right? The login page wants to use the user service. The registration page wants to use the user service. The profile wants to use the user service for different reasons, right? But it's shared data, right? We'll talk about how to share data next week. All right? All right, thank you.